We're TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone and where you're located. Welcome to the TTB Bootcamp webinar series. I am Jennifer Hill, Outreach Program Manager here at TTB, and I'm thrilled to have you all join us today. This is the 5th webinar in our 6-part bootcamp series. If you were unable to join us for the first sessions, no worries. You can find all the presentations on our website at ttb.gov. Just select Get Training from the right-hand navigation and then select TTB Presentations from that Get Training page. The slides for today's presentation are also available on that presentations page if you would like to follow along and use those slides for notes. We are also recording each webinar and plan to have all those recordings posted in the coming months. Those recordings will also be available on our Get Training page, so just a really good page for lots of resources. While visiting ttb.gov, I would be remiss without encouraging you all to sign up for our newsletter, which you can do by selecting the most recent newsletter under News and Events on the homepage, and then enter your email in the subscribe box. Today's webinar session on what to expect in a plant product integrity investigation will be presented by our very own Alex Weekly. Alex is an investigator in our Trade Investigations Division, or TID. She is based in Tennessee and works in the Southeast District of TID. Prior to TTB, Alex worked within the industry where she handled government compliance for a large distillery. So she brings a wealth of knowledge from both the government and industry side. So we are very, very excited to have her here today. Alex will be answering questions at the end of today's presentation. We encourage everyone to use the Q&A functionality within Zoom since the chat function is not turned on for these webinars to submit your questions. You can find that feature by selecting the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our lovely and talented Janelle Christian, Director of our Industry and State Outreach Program, will be moderating those questions at the end for Alex. Before I hand things over to Alex, though, we'd like to get to know our audience a little better. So we are going to ask a couple poll questions, and we will share those results too, just so everybody can get to know each other a little bit. So the first one, yes, there we go, is how many COLAs have you submitted to TTB? And if you don't know what COLA means, that may be a good indication that the answer is maybe 0, but it is a certificate of label approval. So we will give everybody about 30 seconds or so to answer. And then we will share the results. All right. Okay, so we have a good mix. So we've got 31% of you who have never submitted a COLA, and then 47% of you who have submitted 20 or more COLAs. So that's very interesting, almost an even split between 0 and 20 or more. All right, so then the next poll question is going to be, I know what it is, but I'm waiting till it pops up on the screen. There we go. Do you have a dedicated compliance person on staff? And I almost added, I wish, as a response here too. So, but we just have yes or no. All right. All right. So 78% of you, yes, you do have a compliance person on staff, and maybe even you are that compliance person listening to this presentation today. So this will be a great presentation for all of you. And again, Alex does bring a good perspective of having the industry and the government side of things. So this will be very interesting for you all. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Alex and begin presenting the presentation.
Welcome everybody. We appreciate you being here today. My name is Alex Weekly, and like Jennifer said, I am an investigator out of the Southeast District for TTB. And as part of today's TTB Bootcamp series, we'll be going over what to expect during a product integrity investigation. Quick disclaimer before we begin. All of this information being presented to help the public to understand and comply with the laws and regulations. Please make sure you're referring to the regulations for the most updated information, as things can change frequently. All labels shown today are for illustrative purposes only and do contain fictitious data. The Trade Investigations Division, more commonly referred to as TID, is responsible for ensuring that you as an industry member comply with the laws and regulations administered by TTB. TTB has existed as an agency of the U.S. Department of Treasury since 2003, when ATF moved over to the Justice Department. The Treasury Department is the second oldest executive department in our government and was formed just a few weeks after the State Department in 1789. We conduct many different types of investigations, including permit qualifications, application investigations, and revenue investigations. And then the product integrity investigations will be the focus of today's presentation. As investigators, we help to prevent trade practice in the marketplace. We look at your COLAs, we review advertising materials, and of course, we make sure that your excise tax is paid appropriately. Investigators even respond to credible information that suggests contamination or adulteration of alcohol that can cause health-related problems. The objective of any product integrity investigation is to protect the consumer. Our goal is to make sure that the public is getting what they're expecting and what they're paying for, and that it's not harmful for them to ingest. If you bought a bottle of 10-year-old bourbon at a pretty high price point only to learn that the distillery bottle is a 4-year product, you'd be pretty upset, right? I know I would. When an investigator shows up at your facility for a product integrity investigation, we will hold an opening conference, review all of the qualifying documentation, and take a look at your labels and formulas. In reviewing labels and formulas, we look for any manipulated or altered COLAs. And yes, we do see people attempt to pass off an unapproved label as one that appears to be approved. We will also review your advertising as well as your proofing and fill procedures. And we will also take samples to send to our TTB lab for analysis. So we start off our work by having an opening conference. During an opening conference, you will sit down with your investigator or investigators, and we'll go through a brief interview. During this interview, investigators will do their best to get to know you and your business and try to understand your operations to its fullest. We want to know what kind of products you market, what's your best seller, what kind of visitor experiences you offer, and what you believe is the most invaluable part of your business model, whether that be your small batch products, your single barrels, or even your specialty flavors. We'll ask about who handles your operations, who handles your reporting, who handles all of your record keeping, and we might even do brief interviews with those key personnel as well. We ask you for specific records in order to conduct our investigation. We'll ask you to pull your COLAs and your formulas, and we'll ask for the specific samples of your bonded bottled product as well. When we review qualifying documents, we will typically start with your original application. The documents we require for original qualification include your DSP registration, your basic permit application, your distilled spirits bond, if applicable, any personnel questionnaires that have been filed, and any organizational documents submitted with your application. If, for example, your company is an LLC, you'll have articles of organization, operating agreements, and a list of members and managers. We will also ask you to provide any updates to the original documentation as well. Has the business name changed? Has the address changed? Has the operating agreement been updated? Are there new owners, directors, or members of the business that need to be added to your TTB file? These are all things that we are looking for when it comes to your permit. As investigators, we will do our best to help facilitate any changes or amendments that need to be done, and we hope to act as a go-between for industry members in the National Revenue Center. Additionally, we will help to make sure that all persons needing signing authority or power of attorney are properly updated as well. There are some common issues investigators find when reviewing qualifying documentation. Not reporting changes to the business operations is a big one. All changes in ownership, control, or officers and directors have to be reported to the TTB within 30 days of those changes. According to TTB laws and regulations, if there is an unreported change in control or ownership, this invalidates your TTB permit. In plain language, you're operating without a valid permit at that point. So it's imperative that all changes to your business are reported and submitted through your permits online account within 30 days following these changes. Another issue that we often see in the field are unreported changes or alterations to your business premise. Some examples of these would be adding buildings, adding or moving tanks, additions of labs or general premise or office space. And this also includes the addition of any non-contiguous premise as well. It's incredibly important to make sure that your DSP registration and permit is always up to date with the latest changes, as some of these can have serious tax implications. Now, this subject of standards of identity and formula compliance is very key to a product integrity investigation. During these investigations, we will work to determine the standards of identity of your product. The standards of identity is in relation to the class and type of your product and can affect how it should be labeled and marketed. In order to correctly determine this, investigators will look at your required records under Part 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and we will look at how the product is made, what percentages of grain or other fermentables are being used, at what proof is the product distilled at, whether it has been aged and for how long, and what was the product aged in, and what types of ingredients are being added to the product during the processing life of the spirit. If imported products are being used, TTB requires certain certifications. For example, tequila will require a certificate of authenticity from Mexico. And any imported product that would have an age statement would also require certificates of age from the producer of the imported product. Part 5 of the Code of Federal Regulations for Distilled Spirits has listed out what certificates are needed for each imported product. When we're talking certificates for imported products, you as the bottler are responsible for retaining this information on site. So if you are not the importer of record, you need to make sure that you have this information from the importer prior to bottling your product. Some of the largest issues investigators find when reviewing standards of identity are proofing issues, ingredient issues, and age statements. For example, generic whiskey can be distilled from fermented grain of any type at 190 proof. However, bourbon whiskey cannot exceed 160 proof coming off the still and must be fermented from a mash of not less than 51% corn. Some ingredient issues we find are rum made with sorghum. Sorghum is not an appropriate fermentable for rum. It must be made with sugarcane or sugarcane products. In aging issues, we typically see a lot in whiskeys and bourbon. For example, the term straight cannot be used on a label unless the whiskey has been aged for a minimum of 2 years. If you have concerns or questions regarding your product standard of identity, the best place to start would be with the Beverage Alcohol Manual, or BAM. You can find this on the TTB website, and it lists out in a table very specifically each spirit class and type requirements for each product. While on site, investigators will look at your products to see if they require a TTB approved formula. If you have existing formulas for your products, we will compare those approved formulas to your batching records to make sure they are within compliance. We will look at tolerances allotted from your formula and compare those to the batching records as well as the listed ingredients used. Additionally, we will review the process in which the product is made to see if your process complies with the process that you listed on your formula application. As far as submitting formulas go, my recommendation would be to keep it simple for yourself. For example, creating a TTB approved formula for a batched wine gallon amount of 276 wine gallons is going to be very difficult to convert on a larger scale. I recommend submitting formulas for 100-gallon batches or 1,000-gallon batches, so that it's simpler for you and your staff to convert your ranges in order to comply with your formula. The two biggest issues with formula compliance is either not having a formula when the product would require one, or having a formula but not complying with either the ingredients, tolerances, or the production process. If you need to change your formula process or change the ingredients, you will be required to either amend your formula or apply for a new one. Word of caution when changing your formulas is that you could potentially change it so much that it changes the standard of identity of your product, in which case you may need a new COLA approval as well. So be careful when altering your already approved formulas. If you are unsure if your product needs a formula, there is a helpful tool on TTB's website where you can plug in specific information, and it will let you know whether the product you're suggesting or the ingredients that you're using would require a formula. And as always, if you still have questions or are in doubt, please reach out to TTB's Alcohol Labeling and Formula Division. Their contact information can be found on the website. Let's move into looking a little bit about verifying COLAs and labels. During the course of the investigation, investigators will verify a physical inventory of your bonded bottled product. From that inventory, we will take a look at all of the approved COLAs pertaining to your product. We will compare these bottled products to the approved COLAs to look for any changes, alterations, or manipulations. We will review your labels to make sure they meet all of the mandatory requirements, and we will also review any trade names on your labels to make sure they are registered with TTB. In regards to trade names, you will need to verify whether or not your state requires trade name registration. Some do, some do not, but checking with your state to make sure you're within their compliance is always best practice. Quick disclaimer regarding your COLAs: just because you have an approved COLA does not mean it is correct. I know that sounds odd, but your COLAs are reviewed by humans, and humans make mistakes. So it's not uncommon for investigators to find issues with approved COLAs in the field and have to have the industry member apply for a new one and change their label. Sometimes the Alcohol Formula and Labeling Division will grant conditional COLAs with expiration dates. If you have one of these COLAs, investigators will check to make sure you are within the parameters of the condition and that it's still effective. Investigators will review the government warning statements to make sure it's in compliance with Part 16 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And a few of these requirements are that the words government warning are in bold and all capitals, and that the warning statement itself is separate and apart from all other information. TTB does ask that if you have COLAs in your account that are not in use or inactive, please surrender those, as it will help the system to move a little bit faster for you. Some common issues we find when it comes to COLAs, the biggest I see in the field are making changes to the labels that are not allowable. In the industry, it is very common for there to be poor communication between the marketing staff and the compliance staff. If you can remedy this in your business, it will save you a lot of headache in regards to labeling and advertising. I tell industry members that the more fluff or puffery you put on your label, the more work it is for your compliance officer and the bigger chance of your label being in violation of TTB regulations. Everything that is on your label is considered a label claim. If you have on your label distilled with aquifer water from the historic Tennessee Valley Aquifer, as just an example, as an investigator, I want to see documentation that the water came from the aquifer. I want to see documentation that the aquifer name, and I want to see documentation that it is in fact historic. That's a lot of information to prove. Additionally, if you are including blend percentages, mash bills, or any other unique selling points on your labels, all of this will require separate documentation in order to be verified by an investigator. So take it from me, less is more. Advertising is defined very broadly in our regulations. It can allude to radio or television broadcasts or any newspaper, periodical, or publication. You should think in terms of virtually any type of promotional material or even a verbal statement which is in or calculated to induce sales as being advertising. Again, advertising materials include websites and social media accounts. This includes Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and yes, even TikTok. I've recently come to find out that this also includes social media influencers. Very much an example of how this bureau evolves as our industry and our world evolves. Advertising also includes points of sales material such as pamphlets and promotional displays, as well as printed hang tags for your bottles and any specialty opaque cases. Some of the mandatory information for advertising includes class and type statement, commodity statement, alcohol content, and contact information. For a full list of this mandatory information, you can see Part 5 of the Code of Federal Regulations for advertising. Common issues that we see with advertising is missing the required information, adding some health-related claims, or inconsistency with approved graphics. Some examples of this would be advertising a product on your website and the label on the website does not match the TTB approved cola, or adding the proof to your advertising but leaving out the alcohol by volume statement. Proof is not an acceptable replacement for alcohol content when it comes to labeling and advertising. TTB wants to see the alcohol by volume statement. This statement, the letter form ABV is not acceptable. You can abbreviate alc by vol or alc/vol, but again, the letters ABV are not appropriate. If you have advertising questions, I recommend reaching out to TTB's Market Compliance Office. The contact information and the hotline is listed here on this slide. Next, we're going to discuss proof and fill during a product integrity investigation. Quick reminder that in 2021, the standards of fill were updated to now include 700 milliliter, 720 milliliter, 900 milliliter, and 1.8 liter bottles. During an on-site investigation, we will ask you or your staff to conduct a proofing test for us. We will review your procedures for proofing and verify that all of your measuring devices are correctly calibrated and that the records of these calibration tests are being retained for a minimum of 3 years. We will review proofing records to make sure they contain all of the required information. If you are unclear as to what information is required, please refer to 27 CFR 19.600 for a full list of proof and fill record requirements. We see proofing issues often in the field. More times than not, they can stem from one of these procedural issues. Either the equipment is not calibrated annually or at all, or a lot of times distilled spirit specialty products or products with high sugar or solids are not being distilled off prior to proofing. What I mean by this is that you're going to get a very inaccurate proof if you're not conducting a tabletop distillation of your sugar products. We see proofing issues when industry members are not correcting for temperature. A lot of people are using density meters now, and the sales reps will always advertise that their density meters are correcting for temperature. However, this is not always the case. So do your due diligence and make sure that the temperature is corrected for. Proofing issues can have tax implications, so make sure that your procedures are top-notch. If violations are not coming from the actual proof, they tend to come from the proofing records. Part 19 for spirits does an incredible job for detailing exactly what needs to be in each type of record. If you will make templates for all of these required records and compare them to the regulations annually, you will likely never have a record-keeping violation with TTB. When you're testing for fill on your bottling line, again, you will need to make sure that your measuring devices used are calibrated correctly and frequently. This includes scales if you are measuring if you're measuring fill by tare weight, or graduated cylinders if you're measuring fill by volume. Similar to proofing, TTB investigators will ask the staff to conduct a fill test. Some of the things we're looking for on your test and records are which bottling head is the sample being pulled from? How often are these samples being pulled? What's the percent of variation from the required fill? And what, if any, corrective action was taken? Again, these items and more are all listed under 19.600 for fill and proof check records. Make sure that all of the required information makes it on your records. Fill issues are pretty common when measuring devices are not properly calibrated or when fill checks are not being done consistently. I have been to distilleries where bottling line employees are only checking the same 3 heads of an 8-head filler for every fill test, and they had quite a bit of fill issues where the untouched heads were not being tended to. Additionally, fill issues come from incomplete records. Again, make those templates and compare them annually to the regulations. Like proof issues, fill issues can also have tax implications. As a bonus informational nugget to those compliance officers out there, just because there is a template made does not mean the staff is going to fill it out completely or correctly. Part of your job as a compliance officer is to make sure that these records are filled out with the required information and the correct information. Investigators work with our colleagues in one of our laboratories to request analytical work on samples of distilled spirits secured from our field investigations. So we will pull samples from your bonded bottled inventory and send them to the TTB lab. These sample selections will vary based on the size of your inventory and the types of products you produce. Typically, I will pull 2 samples of the same batch for each product that I plan to send to the lab. I will send one of these products for routine analysis, and the other I will box up and have you as the proprietor retain on site. This will help all parties if there is an issue down the line regarding proof and fill, because it will serve as a basis for the batch so that you're able to trace the product back and find out how much was produced, how much is still in bond, and how much was shipped in both interstate and intrastate commerce. Also, if you feel that testing conducted was incorrect, it gives you as the industry member the same product to submit for any outside or third-party testing. After the samples are analyzed by the lab, the results will be discussed with you and the investigator will determine whether or not corrective action is needed. Issues that we find in the lab, obviously the product might be over or under proof, or the product is under fill. As a reminder, the tolerance for proof is 0.3% on all products. The lab often finds issues with bottle headspace as well. On a rare occasion, the lab may find red dye or yellow dye in your products that have not been disclosed on your label, or they might even find high amounts of fusel alcohol that can be harmful to those drinking it. This can come from not cutting your heads or tails correctly. If you would like to review the regulations regarding proof, fill, or headspace, you can see Part 5 and Part 9 of Part 19, of the Code of Federal Regulations. As a wrap up for the investigation, investigators will hold a closing conference. In this conference, we will review all findings regarding violations and what those corrective actions might be. Once the on-site visit is complete, you will work virtually alongside your investigator to provide any additional documentation, information, or clarification regarding all follow-up or outstanding items discussed while on site. It is very important to build a good working relationship with your investigator by responding timely to emails and putting forth the effort it will take for you to come into compliance regarding the violations discussed. TTB strives for voluntary compliance, and a good working relationship can be beneficial when TTB assistance is needed in the future. Violations during an investigation will always be found. It doesn't matter if you're the most compliant distillery in the world. The regulations are so cumbersome for spirits that there will always be violations found by an investigator. To that end, depending on how egregious the violations are, TTB might take administrative adverse action against your permit. Adverse action can range anywhere from a warning letter to suspension or revocation. In between these can be warning conferences or even offers in compromise. I'm unable to give you examples of what might constitute adverse action. This type of administrative action is formed on the basis of the investigation, the cooperativeness of the industry member, as well as any potential jeopardy to the revenue. More times than not, this is handled up higher than your investigators. Our job as investigators is primarily to observe, report, and educate. I mentioned earlier that TTB is big on voluntary compliance. This also means voluntary disclosure of non-compliance. If you come across an issue in your facility and correct it upon its finding, you can report this action to TTB as a voluntary disclosure. As an example of this is that you might be a contract bottler who deals with multiple brand owners or wholesalers. These people send you labels to put on their products. You as the producer have the COLA approval for their product, but for the holidays, they decide to add some holiday jargon and maybe some new graphics, among other things. You were not aware that they made these changes, and new labels are put on the bottle by your bottling staff and shipped out. Now you have products in the marketplace that have no approved COLAs. The corrective action would be to immediately apply for the COLA, stop all production of the product until the new graphics and jargon are approved, and disclose the issue to TTB with your corrective action. You may ask, well, if I'm correcting it, then why does TTB even need to know about it? Well, the voluntary disclosure is here to help the industry avoid violations during an investigation when a genuine mistake is made. If I were to come into your facility later for a product integrity investigation and find this issue, I would write you up a violation, and that would go in your permanent TTB file. If you had voluntarily disclosed it, then I would not write the violation. To be clear, TTB may not always consider a voluntary disclosure voluntary under certain circumstances. For example, if I send you an email that I'll be visiting your facility for an investigation in 2 weeks, and you submit one or more voluntary disclosures in those 2 weeks about issues that have happened months or even years ago, those would not be deemed voluntary in lieu of the pending announced investigation. Okay, so here's a list of 10 district field offices and their contact information. Again, I'm out of the Southeast District. If you're not sure which district your state falls in, you can contact any of these for questions. Or on the next slide, we have a convenient map that tells you exactly where your state falls in. And then we provided you a list of some internet resources. You can type in some of these keywords into the TTB search engine. There is an asterisk at the bottom. We've found that if you're using the TTB search engine on the website, if you type TTB prior to your keyword, the link should keep you on the TTB website as opposed to sending you to an alternate web page for information. Okay, and on this slide, we've got some links to the formulas homepage if you have formula questions. Additionally, on the TTB website, you can subscribe to the newsletter that will provide TTB and industry updates. You can also subscribe to automated reminders for your reports and returns so that those are all filed timely. There's a link at the bottom here for Permits Online Help Center. I understand that sometimes it can be tricky trying to find the right amendment for your permit when you're on Permits Online, so this is super helpful. On this next slide, we have links for the laws and regulations as well as any public guidance offered by TTB, and a link for the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act that can be found here, along with any other federal publications. In this next slide, we have added the list of allowable revisions to your labels, which would not require a new COLA. Again, if you're still unsure whether your product would require a new COLA with any changes you intend on making, please reach out to Alcohol Labeling and Formula Division. They're very good at what they do and they can help you with that. We've also added a link to the formula tool that we discussed earlier, as well as a link to the proofing video series. If some of your eyes glazed over when I mentioned tabletop distillations for proofing high solid products, please take some time to watch some of these tutorials. Thank you guys so much for attending this webinar. I hope it was helpful. Please take some time to give us your feedback. If there's something else you would like to hear from us about or something we can explain better, please let us know.
Visit TTB's official YouTube channel at USTTB.gov for more TTB-related content. And remember to click subscribe so you'll always know when we upload new videos.